Hello, and welcome to History 300, the origins of the First World War. Lecture 1, Introduction, Why the Origins of the First World War Matter. Almost exactly 100 years ago, on Sunday, June the 28th, 1914, at around 11 a.m. in the morning, in the town of Sarajevo, in the Austro-Hungarian province of Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his wife Sophie were killed by a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist called Gavrilo Princip. What followed over the next 37 days would become known to history as the July Crisis. On July the 28th, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. On August the 1st, Austria-Hungary's ally, Germany, declared war on Serbia's ally, Russia. On August the 3rd, Germany declared war on Russia's ally, France. And on August the 4th, the United Kingdom declared war on Germany in retaliation for Germany's invasion of Belgium. On June 28, 1914, the day Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, Europe was at peace. 37 days later, 5 of its great powers were at war. A war that became known as the First World War. In this course, we will be studying just how and why this First World War broke out. The First World War lasted for 4.5 years, until November the 11th, 1918. During those 4.5 years, at least 20 million soldiers and civilians died as a direct result of the fighting. At least another 20 million people across the world died due to the Spanish influenza pandemic, which broke out in the closing stages of the war, and which was aggravated by it. The formal end of the war in November 1918 did not mean that all the world was at peace. Civil wars and revolutionary wars continued for many more years across Europe and Asia. The war resulted in the collapse of 4 empires: Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Ottoman Turkey. Other empires, such as Britain's and France's, survived, but suffered devastating losses, both in terms of lives and resources, and never truly recovered from the stresses of the war. On the other hand, the war raised up 2 non-European nations, Japan and the United States of America, to world power status for the first time. Ideologies blossomed in the wake of the First World War. The 1917 revolution in Russia introduced the world to communism, and dissatisfaction with the outcome of the war in both Italy and Germany introduced the world to fascism and Nazism. The origins of the Second World War and of the Holocaust can be traced directly to the war of 1914 to 18. As empires toppled, so new states were created: Ireland, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Finland, the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, Yugoslavia. Although most of the fighting in the First World War was confined to Europe, its effects reverberated across the world. It caused a remaking of the Middle East, producing such new political entities as Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. The weakening of the European imperial powers encouraged the growth of national resistance movements in the colonial world, which would lead from the 1940s onwards to rapid global decolonization. In 1914, Europeans controlled 85% of the world's land surface. By 1970, almost all of their overseas possessions had been lost. The First World War reversed 5 centuries of European global expansion. The war also brought about sweeping technological changes: new forms of transportation, such as aeroplanes and tanks, new weapons, such as poison gas. It accelerated the growth of national governments and the power of states over their own citizens. It inspired changes in social organisation. Thanks to the war, for instance, the franchise was expanded in many countries, providing many working-class men the vote for the first time, and winning women the right to participate in the electoral system. It caused old bourgeois norms in moral and sexual behaviour to be challenged for the first time. It accelerated the decline of the old European aristocracy, paving the way for the growth of the modern meritocratic social order. It set off important new artistic movements such as modernism, Dadaism, and surrealism. The art, literature, music and culture of the post-1914 world was irrevocably marked by the scars of war. George Kennan, the American diplomat, would describe the First World War as the grand seminal catastrophe of the 20th century. For better or worse, it established the modern world that we live in. So if we're asked, why do the origins of the First World War matter? One obvious answer is, because the First World War was simply the most important event of the last 100 years. In a very real sense, we are still living with it today. But there are other answers to that question too. The issue about why the war broke out was never just a dry, scholarly matter. It played an important role in 20th century politics in its own right. At the end of the war, the treaty that was drawn up to settle matters between the two sides, the Versailles Treaty as it was known, included a clause, Clause 231, which blamed Germany specifically for the outbreak of the war. Clause 231 offered justification for all the other punitive measures that the treaty included at Germany's expense, such as losses of territory to other states, restrictions on the post-war German armed forces, reparations payments that had to be made principally to the French, and Allied occupation forces which stayed in place in Germany for 10 years. Needless to say, the Germans hugely resented this. Indeed, the post-war German government created and funded a think tank entirely devoted to studying the origins of the war and specifically to refuting Clause 231. Popular resentment amongst Germans at being blamed for the outbreak of the war arguably contributed to the rise of Hitler in the later 1920s and 30s. Even after the Second World War, the origins issue of the First remained controversial in Germany. One German historian, Fritz Fischer, who argued strongly that Clause 231 was basically correct, had German government funds withdrawn for a lecture tour of the United States. His office in Hamburg was firebombed. That was in the 1960s, but more recently Christopher Clark's book The Sleepwalkers has been an international bestseller too. In Britain, the centenary of the outbreak of the war has produced a national debate about the difficulty of knowing exactly how to commemorate it. Is it supposed to be remembered as the beginning of a noble crusade or as a futile tragedy? The outbreak of the First World War became an important model of crisis diplomacy in the years that followed 1918. For instance, in the 1930s, one of the reasons why the British and French governments were so cautious about confronting Nazi Germany's aggressive moves in Eastern Europe was their fear that an obscure foreign quarrel would set off a war in the same way that Franz Ferdinand's assassination had done so in 1914. And later, during the Cold War, the situation in Europe in 1914 was seen as eerily similar to the nuclear brinksmanship game that was being played out between the USA and the USSR. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, President John F. Kennedy read what was then a very popular book about the opening months of the First World War, Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August. And he was so alarmed by what he read that he gave copies of the book to his cabinet members and principal military advisors. Kennedy was struck by the profound and unpredictable effects that a rapid escalation of a seemingly minor diplomatic crisis could have. Today, the origins of the First World War are once again in people's minds, not just because of the centenary, but because of the situation in Ukraine. Once again, an obscure quarrel in Eastern Europe has the potential to spill over into a major conflict between the great powers. There are other, less ominous reasons also why the story of the First World War's origins remains interesting. The outbreak of the First World War raises interesting methodological questions for historians, for instance. There is the issue of how reliable and relevant the surviving documents are. There is the issue of how much importance individuals play in historical events versus structural forces such as nationalism and imperialism. And there is also the fact that the outbreak of the war is probably the most intensely studied moment in all of history. Even as the war began 100 years ago, people had already begun arguing about why it was starting and who, if anyone, was to blame. As soon as the first shots were fired, governments immediately began issuing self-exculpating collections of documents. These were known as the coloured books. And after the war, many of the major players involved in the July crisis, who had survived, published their memoirs. thousands and thousands of books have been written about the subject in dozens of languages in years since 1914. Every participant in the decision-making, however minor his or her role was at the time, has had their letters and diaries scrutinised, or were interviewed by historians while they were still alive. Entire careers have been devoted to studying the 37 days of the July crisis alone. Yet despite all this attention, there is not, and never has been, any agreement amongst historians as to what exactly happened that summer 100 years ago, and why. In a sense, then, the origins of the war represent a kind of challenge to historians, because if we can't understand such a minutely observed event, will we ever really be able to understand anything? Okay, in the next lecture, we're going to look a little more closely at the issue of causality and the war. In particular, at the difference between its so-called specific causes and its broader or deeper causes. See you then.